Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We got part two of Oversimplified WW2, and I'm ready. This is where my grandfather has entered the scene. It's not until later of the war, of course. Part two, I think, starts at 1942? Well, no, 1940. 1940 to 1941. Because I don't think Pearl Harbor and stuff happened yet. But anyways, getting way ahead of myself, so let's get to it.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed a defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude...
First off, Stalin did the Great Purge, I think 1 or 2 years before he attacked Finland. So everybody that was going into Finland was extremely inconfident and super untrained in all this. So, of course, and plus, Russia was sending massive amounts of troops into a white setting in brown and green coats. Of course they're going to stand out, especially to Simohaiha, the White Death, and just nipping them off. But it's come on. Green coats and white snow, and you have inconfident generals because Stalin killed off his senior generals because he freaking thought they were going to take over or overthrow him. Crazy, insane, absolutely insane.
Put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe." And sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won.
Especially when you get attacked, which in probably some way that America knew a little before it actually happened, which but Roosevelt was going to win that election anyways because he's the most popular president ever in our history. If he was still alive today, he would still probably be president because we wouldn't even be in the situation we are in now if Roosevelt could have lived forever and wanted to stay a presidency. We would technically have a king at that point, but we would have universal health care. Nobody be going hungry because, we'll actually have policies to make people not be hungry. Social Security would still be strong, and universal schooling. Our tax money is actually being valuable instead of just going to tax breaks for billionaires and our bloated military budget, but I digress. This is not the topic for modern day politics, so.
Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. And then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea.
Why can't we do that now? I want to try that. Putting wood and ice together, that sounds kind of easy. But why can't we do that now? It's probably light, it floats. If bullets bounce off of it. Now missiles though.
In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma.
There's a documentary about Alan Turing. I haven't seen it yet, but I do want to see it at some point. And the way they treated him because he was homosexual is just it's such a shame. They should have praised that guy for what he did.
The code and the U-boats,
because technically without him, I think he's Canadian, I think. But would they have cracked the U-boats code and stuff without him? I don't know.
gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded. Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt. And they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out.
The biggest mistake anybody can make.
With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring? No. Keep going. But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles. That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift. Perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold. And the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory.
I kind of understand Hitler's mentality there, because maybe he was thinking, oh, maybe if I make the United States fight a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific, it might spread the resources out, and we might have a chance to eliminate them. But come on, bro. I think even America didn't know how powerful it was at that point. When you have rednecks in the backwoods of Pennsylvania and Missouri and California and stuff, making weird crap, random crap, you're going to find out why that's a bad thing for, well, good for America, because we can do hillbilly stuff in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, right? Always innovating with random stuff.
But they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel...
And that, like, did... So, I understand they didn't attack that, but is it because that the Navy actually fought back enough for where the Japanese lost too much aircraft to be able to attack the naval repair yards and the fuel storages and the submarine stations? Or they just went in, bombed a few things and left? Because if they like ran out of troops, or like, you know, the aircraft and stuff, and they couldn't attack it because the American Navy actually fought back hard enough that it basically repelled the full attack for their full success. That's also another thing. I don't know too much about why they didn't attack that, but anyways.
storage tanks or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again.
And plus, I believe there was a whole crew of ships out in sea, like a day or two out from the ocean, so they didn't even attack the main fleet.
Soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the...
I hate that he did this. I mean, I'm grateful he did that, because it made him lose the war. But as a strategist that loved battle tactics, this irritates me.
Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the Sixth Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held off the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the Sixth Army.
Now, the Germans did have flanks protected, but they were all like mainly Czechoslovakian and Romanians and probably Yugoslavians, which hated being in the army for Germany because they were basically conscripts, kind of like slaves at that point. So they kind of like just, they didn't like, I don't want to fight for this army. So they just gave up and surrendered.
Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, "No, you stay." The entire Sixth Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movement.
Now, Rommel was not there. I believe if Rommel was there and he didn't get fooled by the tactic up here, we'd be in a different storyline. Now, would they have won that battle? I don't think so. I think paratrooping soldiers behind the lines to sabotage stuff would have been the key of winning the battle in either scenario. It would just have been more loss of life, and it would have taken longer to create that beachhead and push in forward, which meaning down the line, the Soviets would have conquered more land. And at this point right now, Germany's pretty much done. It's just we need to occupy as much land before the Soviets take it over. So we're fighting for peace. Soviets were fighting for conquest.
Inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the far east, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end. And the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance.
And how difficult, like, people always say, oh, the Japanese were going to surrender. Not the military. The military wanted to die in battle. Now, of course, that's a broad statement for the whole thing, but because there's definitely a lot of Japanese that did surrender and got away from the war and lived great lives afterwards. But the majority were literally doing kamikaze attacks to stop the Americans because some of the civilians that lived on the island thought the Americans were going to eat them, which is just insane. I seen the videos of that, people sacrificing themselves so they wouldn't be getting eaten by the Americans. It's crazy how propaganda really works on people's minds.
In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender?" No, sir. They want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent
What
off.
a perfect response. Perfect response. If I was the commanding general, I would have done the same thing.
As their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed...
Right here. Right here is where my grandfather joined the fight. General Patton's Third Army.
to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back.
Right there, when my grandfather joined the front, it was January 15th is when he was in a foxhole with some other GI in Belgium. And that's where his story started. For 4 months, he was crossing the German lands from here to about here, where he was like several miles north of Leipzig. So like over here somewhere.
Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces.
Yeah,
the
like
Allies pushed into Germany from both sides.
somewhere.
The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost.
Yep.
Berlin fell, and with it...
So he was probably... Berlin was right here, so it was probably like over here when my grandfather got wounded. And that was April 23rd. So technically it wasn't before Hitler did the thing in his bunker.
Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out, one to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice: either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July,
I remember telling my grandfather that even though how bad the atomic bomb is, and I don't have a very good answer. I don't have a good answer on what I would do, because if without the atomic bomb and we had to attack the mainland, my grandfather would have had to been sent over there, because by the time August came along, he was better. He was flying back into the States because he was healthy and he was fine and he was ready to live his life. But if we attacked the mainland, they needed like a minimum 1 million soldiers. And since my papa was battle hardened already, he would have been part of that. And he might have gotten killed then. And I wouldn't exist because my dad wasn't born until 1963. It's this part is absolutely awful, and I just don't have an answer of what I would have done here, because either situation is unfathomable, and ton of death is going to happen regardless. And I guess the atomic bomb may make more sense because it wasn't to stop the war and have Japan surrender. It was also to send a message to the Soviet Union, because before the bombs were dropped, they saw that the Soviets were occupying territory and treating the people like second-class citizens and completely degrading what they took over. And it just sucks that how messy the war had to end like that, and how we had to send a message to the Soviet Union that helped us through that, to be, hey, listen, we don't like each other and we have the power, so don't be messing around. So I don't know, it sucks, but I'm just glad it's over. And living 80 years afterwards, I can be friends with Germans. I can be friends with the Russians. Actually, my one friend that lives in Germany was born in Russia, even though he wasn't Russian, which is a little weird, but I can be friends with Russians. I can be friends with the Germans. I can be friends with the Italians. I can be friends with the Japanese. I can be friends with the Chinese and Koreans, and I can be friends with anybody in the world now, and I'm hoping that it never ends up like this ever again.
fly, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for
That
use.
stuff scares
America
me
and the
so
UK were
much.
also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its
Yeah.
captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their...
I do want to go there someday and to see that and absolutely show my respects. If I'm traveling to anywhere, I want to show my absolute respect for anybody. And quick side note on some areas in Japan that tourism freaking ruined for everybody else. I understand that you don't want tourism over in that place anymore. I get it. And it breaks my heart that I will never get to see that, because for someone that shows empathy and respect for just everybody's culture and stuff, that somebody else didn't respect that and got there before I did and completely ruined it. For anybody that shows respect and empathy for other people's culture and ways of life and stuff, it pisses me off.
main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press, to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me.
Alright. So, final thoughts is it might not be the war to end all wars like they thought World War One was going to be, but it should be the last World War. It should be the last war that had the whole world hate each other. I think there will always be war, no matter how long we are around, But I'm just so glad that I can be friends with anybody in the world now and not have to live in a world like that. So, let me know if you like me talking about history stuff, because I love doing it. I might do it anyways, but there's a lot to learn. I'm just an amateur history lover, so I feel like I'm on the bottom toe about history and stuff, and it's fun to learn. It's fun to learn. It helps you understand how things got the way they did and how things happened during that time and how things turned out afterwards. And it just helps appreciate the cultures around the world and be able to be friends with everybody. So that's all I got. I'll catch you guys in